Well, good afternoon, everyone. I know some of you are still signing on to our webinar, so we're glad you could join us today. This webinar is our Looking at Local Housing Policy Solutions. And I am your moderator for the day, Sarah Reynolds, and I'm just delighted to walk you through our agenda and just provide a few opening comments before we dive into our content. Now, we have quite a bit to cover today, so I do want to just cover a few very brief housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, and so to make sure we have great sound quality for the recording, all participants will be muted. We also have disabled the chat. However, when we get to the Q&A section of our agenda today, you can use the Q&A feature in the Zoom, and we'll do our best to address those questions that you all have as an audience. I also want to just share that after the event, when we do have that recording, we will be sharing it with everyone through both the Colorado Gives website as well as the Bell Policy Center website. So before we dive in, I wanted to just cover really briefly what we're going to be discussing today. As you know, we are going to be talking about those local housing policy solutions. And so we're going to just cover the basics of the process for developing housing, how long it takes, what are the key phases, some major costs or delays that can occur. And we're hoping that at the end of this, you'll understand what different kinds of policy changes can do to increase the supply and affordability of housing in our local communities. So we've got two fabulous speakers who are going to be reviewing this content with us. And again, hold on to those questions for the end of our session when we have that Q&A period. So our first exercise today is actually our Menti slide. And if you haven't used Menti before, it's a fantastic tool to be able to just gain a little audience participation. Now, as you'll see in the chat, if to participate in the Menti, you just have to go to that website that is on the screen there, or you can snap that QR code so you can join us and you can participate in our live Menti demonstration. All right, so I think we're ready for our warm-up question. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your knowledge about how housing is developed? We've got, I think, over 80 people who have registered for this presentation today, so probably have a big range of folks in terms of their expertise. All right, so it looks like we've got quite a few of you who actually do have a little bit of expertise in this, and quite a few of you who feel like you probably have a lot to learn. So that's always helpful to know just the baseline of our audience and who's participating. Our next question is going to test your familiarity with just a few key terms that our speakers are going to be bringing up today. So when we're talking about housing, what does AMI stand for? And we've got average mountain index, area median income, or abatement miles in. Oh, this is a smart crowd. You all are spot on. It is area median income. And when we often talk about housing as being affordable, we use AMI and that percentage as a way to define what that income range is that we're trying to establish. And in Jefferson County, we're talking about 60% to 120% AMI, and that would equate to households that are making between $52,000 and $150,000 a year, depending on the size of the household. All right, our second question that I think we're ready for. So far, you guys are doing great on this quiz. When developing housing, what is something that might be part of the entitlement process? Is it zoning and land use, environmental review, or design review? We'll give you a moment to log in or log your responses. Got a couple of them there. All right, this is a little bit of a trick question because all of these answers are correct. The entitlement process for meeting legal requirements for developing on a particular piece of land, which is basically showing the local authorities that what you're proposing meets all those requirements. And so all three of those pieces are part of that entitlement process. And certainly our speakers are going to be diving into that, those topics a little bit in more detail. So thank you everyone for participating in our Menti. I think that wraps up our quiz to start things off. And so now we're going to transition into our first speaker. I'm really pleased to welcome David Duncan. David has a 30-year career in development and construction. He's worked on all types of development, including residential, in many different roles as a developer, a consultant, an engineer, and a contractor, and previously led development for a national home builder covering multiple states. He currently lives in Jefferson County and also serves as the co-chair of the Jeffco Continuum Housing Task Force. So, David, you're going to be walking us through some of the basics of how housing is developed. So, I think many of us want to know, what does it really take to develop housing here in our Metro Denver area, and what are the biggest challenges? So, David, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me today. It sounds like we have a fairly astute crowd on real estate development, so hopefully this is not covering stuff that people already know. But those of you who already know, doing actually any kind of development, residential, commercial, industrial, is a very expensive and a lot of times arduous and long process, fraught with actually a lot of risk that developers undertake in order to do these. So I have a little presentation I will walk us through. So I am also the owner and founder of C3 Land, which is also for development and advocacy for attainable housing. So today we're talking specifically about residential development. Multifamily development is sometimes classified as residential, sometimes as commercial, but I'll just make a few touch points on that. And my slide is not changing. There we go. What does it take to create new housing? I think this is a great place to start. Well, number one, it takes money. It takes money to do and build almost anything or any kind of business here in the United States. Entitling and developing land for housing is very expensive. Residential development requires money in the form of equity or debt, both of which have a cost attached to them. And the equity or debt is very subject to the conditions of lending within the market and interest rates, same as mortgages. We all know about last year how the Fed raised interest rates greatly. That did not just affect mortgages, that affected the money that people have to borrow to actually do developments. And higher rates make it harder for projects to quote unquote pencil, which is an industry term for it means the money works for the project. It also involves entitlements, design, and construction. There are different types of development in the zoning world. A by right development means that it is following the existing zoning and codes of that piece of property and is normally an administrative process or a much simpler process. If the zoning that is needed for the project is not existing on the property, it has to go through what's called a rezoning, where you have to go through a public process and go to the planning commission and or city and county council and ask them to change that designation on that property to meet the project. It is a public approval, and public approvals always in the world of real estate development are very risky because they are subject to community input, to the plans of the county, to the opinion really of the staff and the county or city commissioners. So the development process, two types, public approvals and administrative approvals. And if the flow chart on the right gives you a headache, that's why I put it in there, because it is a very iterative and long process. And that is more or less a generic kind of flow chart, but very accurate on what it takes to get something from the beginning to the end and actually build something. Public approvals require public notice and approvals by planning commission and or city council. Types of public approvals are rezonings, requests for special use, preliminary and final plats, which is for a subdivision, and service plans for metro districts are usually approved by the local jurisdiction. Administrative approvals are approvals that don't have to go through a public process. Often there is a notice and maybe a community meeting involved, but it is not a public approval process, it's administrative. So all of the requirements for approval of that plan are contained within the regulations of the jurisdiction. Types of those are minor amendments, variances, lot adjustments, and building permits usually do not go through a public process. So Jefferson County, this is a slide from a planning commission in Jefferson County that would go through a rezoning. Rezoning would be the longest path to get a development underway. And this is a little flow chart for that process. Starts with a community meeting, goes up to the referral process after formal application. Referral processes take between 28 and 45 days each. There's a minimum of 2. I've seen up to 11 referrals happen on a project, which we're talking about kind of years of kind of going through And referrals are really, they send the plans out to all the related agencies. That is the water district, the fire district, CDOT, Parks and Wildlife, to kind of get their input on the plan. When you're finally done with that process and the staff feels like it is ready for presentation to the public, you go to a planning commission hearing and or board of county commissioners hearing. Each jurisdiction has a slight nuances to this process, but this is the basic process for all of those times. So we're talking about timelines after. This is just for the rezoning. After the rezoning, you need to submit your plat or SDP, site development plan, if it's a multifamily project, and engineering docs. That can take another 6 to 12 months after this rezoning process. You don't, until the rezoning process is complete, you don't actually have the right to build what is being proposed on that property. So most people don't proceed. It's called proceeding at risk prior to having that approval. Another 6 to 12 months for those engineering docs, building plans, another 3 to 4 months, sometimes concurrently. So really you can see this process can add up to 18 to 24 months from the beginning of a submission to getting a building permit and being able to actually go out there and break ground and start building something. And I'll just add, a developer could spend $250,000 before you even get there to having a permit to break ground. So what are the barriers to building cheaper housing? It really mostly comes down to cost. As with most businesses here in Colorado, the cost of land and construction, the cost of borrowing the money in order to do the development, the impact fees and water. Water is actually a very unique component where in other parts of the country, it's not really a factor in doing a development. Water can be very, very expensive here in Colorado, especially if you go up to more rural areas where you have to use Colorado Big Thompson. The cost of the raw water just to serve one single family unit can be $40,000 to $45,000 in those jurisdictions, slightly less here in the Denver metro area. Liability and cost of building single family attached product, that's a whole nother kind of subject of the missing middle that we have here. I believe that's been talked about already in other webinars. Cost of entitling or zoning the land for residential use can sometimes be referred to as the zoning tax. There's a cost attached to that. No growth policies and restrictive zonings are huge barriers to getting additional housing put up. And actually, this will eventually work itself out, but there were supply chain issues related to COVID where there was a huge demand in housing, in new houses during COVID and coming out of COVID, that there were huge material shortages. I mean, windows, garage doors, appliances, all of that stuff. So that the cost of all of those parts and pieces that make up a house went up tremendously during that time. And generally, they don't come back down. They might stabilize, but they don't really come back down. So here's kind of the breakdown. What you can see on the right is basically what's called a capital stack for a project. You can see that probably, over 90% of the money that has to go into building a development is borrowed. Basically, it's either a grant, incentive, or it's borrowed through equity or debt. The land basis is normally about 3 to 6% of the total cost. If it needs to go through a rezoning, the quote unquote zoning tax can be up to $5,000 or $10,000 a unit. Typically, single family detached lots cost $90,000 to $125,000 to develop. That's just to put in streets, water, sewer, all the landscaping, curbs, driveways, all the things that you need just to have a house there. Water rights, water service can cost $25,000 to $50,000 a unit. Impact fees imposed by each jurisdiction, that's for schools, transportation, and the term is derived from the impact that all of these new houses are going to have on community services. That can add another $25,000 to $50,000. Vertical construction costs have been recently $120 to $140 per square foot for production builders. And if you have to borrow that private equity money to get it done, the cost of that can be 15 to 25%, because as the rates go up in the market, the investors want a higher return, not just to keep their money in the stock market, to invest it in a more risky venture like this. So the truth is, if you want to know why nobody is selling single family detached houses for $300,000, it is literally because they cannot build them for $300,000, except under unique circumstances. And everybody in the industry is trying to find a way to reduce some of these costs in one of these buckets right here, so that they can sell houses at a market cost. So zoning and regulation impacts definitely have something to do with the cost of building new housing. Taps and impact fees, you add those together, they can be 50, even up to $100,000 in some places. Density restrictions increase per unit cost. The more units you can put in a development, the more you get to spread that cost over the units. So higher density equals lower cost. Parking ratios add a necessary cost. This was just brought up on the Housing Continuum Task Force call before this one, where Family Tree organization and long approval timelines is down here too. And they are a nonprofit, just building 85 permanent supportive housing units in Arvada, had a 6-month delay. In addition to that timeline that we just talked about, had a 6-month delay in getting their approvals. So this is not just public builders and market rate builders that have to deal kind of with these delays and things. Everybody has to deal with them. The nonprofits, Foothills Housing Authority, Family Tree, Habitat for Humanity, any of these people that are trying to build housing have these same barriers, these same things that have to be dealt with. Rent control is great for those who are living in a unit and will not move for a long time, but it actually disincentivizes building additional units. Long approval timelines and delays. We already saw 18 to 24 months. Time is money. That is add cost to a project and actually deter new development. If a certain jurisdiction has a reputation as being hard to get through, developers will avoid building anything in that jurisdiction. Minimum lot sizes that are way too big, that keeps the density from getting larger. Arbitrary growth caps severely limit development of additional housing. I believe there was a piece of legislation that was passed by the legislature last year that tried to address that. The graphic on the right is kind of a measure of that regulatory strictness. And if you can see where Denver is in the box. The only metro areas that are more strict, have higher regulatory strictness than Denver are all coastal cities. Los Angeles, Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, New York, all the places where, believe it or not, that are kind of in competition for the highest cost of housing with Denver. So you can see there's a pattern there. I just love this slide. I couldn't resist. I did this on another presentation just to Google. Everybody knows how wild and crazy and terrible the housing crisis in San Francisco is. So I started doing a little research. And the two best quotes that I got from that are from the Housing Policy and Practice Review. Past planning and zoning practices created major inequities across San Francisco, which was basically red line zoning back in the 60s, in terms of which neighborhoods would host the majority of the city's housing density and affordability. From the professor of economics, UC Berkeley, the problem with high rents in San Francisco is not Google buses or tech jobs. The problem with high rent is a very, very constrained supply of housing, and the housing supply is so constrained because we made it so constrained. The city did it. So all of that just to exemplify that housing policies and regulatory policies have a direct impact on the cost of developing and building new housing, and that has a direct impact on the supply, for which there's been multiple discussions in previous webinars about the shortage of housing and how far behind we are basically on housing supply. So I appreciate you letting me have the time to make a presentation, and I will be open to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And we will have audience Q&A at the end of our presentation. But before we go to our next speaker, I did have a question for you because this comes up so often whenever we talk about density. When you reduce regulatory policies and just create more flexibility and fewer regulation around these issues that we've talked about, there tends to be some concern amongst neighborhoods that reducing those policies is going to lead to a lot of density, and that when there's an increase in density, it just changes the character of their neighborhood. It impacts their streets, their schools. It can have a pretty big impact. Can you speak a little bit to that and maybe some of the misconceptions on what density means or how it can be defined in multiple ways?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, that's a common refrain that we hear. I think everybody on the call would agree that there's a housing crisis in Colorado, but when it comes down to, okay, well, let's build something next to your neighborhood, there's a tendency for everybody to pop up and go, oh, no, we can't do that. There is no way out of a 40,000 unit housing shortage other than to build more housing. That is the only way that you get out of that kind of a hole. And I don't think it's one thing. It's not just market rate, more market rate housing. It's not just more subsidized housing. It's going to take all of that to make a dent in that housing shortage. I am not, that does not necessarily mean anything anywhere. Each of the jurisdictions that we're talking about, Jefferson County, Arvada, Golden, Lakewood, all have what's called comprehensive or long-range plans that identify places where it is appropriate to put more density in those places. But they're obviously going to have to be in places that the density isn't already there, right? These are new buildings that we're talking about. So there is an order and a plan to where that should go. I encourage everybody to participate in their jurisdiction's planning and long-range planning and comprehensive plans. You know, that is a public process. You kind of have you do have a say in that. But there are a lot of good people working on that and trying to make it so that that density goes in appropriate ways, in appropriate places, not just wherever somebody wants to put it.
Excellent, thank you. And that's actually a wonderful transition to our next speaker who's going to dive into that in a little more detail. I'm pleased to introduce Molly Fitzpatrick. Molly is a co-founder and managing director at Root Policy Research, which is a nationally recognized community planning and housing research firm. Molly's expertise is helping public sector clients understand their housing and community development challenges and develop meaningful policy actions to improve communities. So Molly, thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you take it from here and continue the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Appreciate it. And David, thanks for the great perspective on kind of development challenges, as well as some of the barriers, both market as well as kind of publicly created barriers. And so really what I'm going to talk through quick is just what are some of the policy levers that are available to local communities to address some of those challenges that David was just talking through. So because I'm a consultant, I can't function without a slide deck. And so I am going to share a PowerPoint, which will hopefully be helpful to you all as well. So as we think about the policy levers that local jurisdictions kind of have in their repertoire, there's sort of three different groups. There's lots of specific policies. We're not going to dive into every single one today, but in terms of how they are structured or how they are organized, and sorry, my screen is being a little bit weird, but I just want to make sure you see policy levers for affordable housing. Are we seeing the red screen? Great, perfect. So kind of the three different groups of how local jurisdictions address housing affordability challenges are, number one, programs that are really directed towards specific households. So they help support or stabilize households. Some of the examples of types of programs you might think about are eviction prevention, housing counseling, emergency rental assistance, or even down payment assistance. But really thinking about kind of programs that are direct to households to help stabilize and support affordability. The next group of policies is subsidies that create or preserve income qualified or income restricted affordable housing. We sometimes talk about this as capital A affordable housing. So you're thinking about not just market producing relatively affordable housing, but actual public subsidies that help bring down the cost either of development or the cost of the rent or purchasing amount for those households. So examples here include like the low income housing tax credit program, which is a federal program that helps subsidize affordable rental housing. Think about community land trusts for those that are familiar with those, and they essentially kind of bring down the cost of ownership opportunities as well. And so these are basically subsidies that bring down those costs that David was just talking about. And then the kind of third category of different policy levers are going to be land use and zoning tools that local jurisdictions control. And typically when we're thinking about these types of interventions, we're looking at how do we make market rate development more efficient. So instead of saying we're going to actually subsidize and bring down the cost and then make sure there's an income restriction, so it's directed towards specific households, we're saying, how can we just make the market work better to deliver the things that our community needs, to deliver a wider variety of price points? And that has to do with just being more efficient, both with land use, but also processes within kind of the entitlement process, like David was talking about. So these can apply pretty differently across different types, different kind of places along the housing spectrum. And as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, this webinar series is looking mostly at workforce housing or kind of that mid-range of housing. Those policy levers that I just talked about really apply kind of across the board. And so when we think about the housing spectrum, this graphic illustrates, it's a graphic from the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, and they kind of categorize the different ranges of housing and price points across this spectrum. So starting kind of at the lowest affordability end, which is below 30% AMI or area median income. That typically includes things like permanent supportive housing, shelter options, or traditional housing. Then 30% to 80% AMI is really what we call affordable rental housing that usually sometimes has an income restriction, sometimes is provided by the market. Then moving up into market rate rentals, about 80% AMI and up, as well as home ownership opportunities at kind of 50% AMI and up. And when we think about those different policy levers, toward that lower end of the housing spectrum, you're really going to need that subsidy effort. As David mentioned, you can't build a house right now for $300,000, but certainly there are folks that need that price point, right? And so we think about kind of that lower end is going to need some type of public subsidy, whether that's a cash subsidy or a land donation or some other kind of way of bringing the cost down. As we move up across the housing spectrum, that's when we really start to see land use and zoning tools come into play in a really effective way to help leverage what the market is doing and make it more efficient, which allows the market to kind of pull back a little bit lower into that income spectrum. A lot of that was kind of illustrated through David's slides as well. So we think about this webinar series where we're focused primarily on the workforce or middle income range, which is about 60 to 120% AMI. You can see are the policies that are going to be used to address this component of the housing spectrum are probably a little bit of public assistance, so maybe some of that subsidy, but largely in that land use and zoning tool category to help leverage the market to partner to deliver the outcomes that we need. So as an example, David mentioned this one as well, but density bonus. So I just want to kind of walk through how do these policies actually fit with the different parts of the development costs and different parts of the development process that David was talking about. So in this example, we're looking at a density bonus. So you kind of take the first lot here, which has one house on it. So let's say the current zoning allows one house per half acre. And so you have a lot size that's fairly large and one house on it. If that gets rezoned or if the entitlement zoning changes to say, well, look, we're going to allow a little bit more density on this land. And by density, I just mean the number of dwelling units per acre that are allowed on that lot. I don't necessarily mean it can be a giant multifamily or apartment. We're just talking about increasing the number of dwelling units per acre, which is typically how planners characterize density within a zoning code. And so acknowledging that if we bump up the density and say, well, now we can do 4 homes on this half acre lot, so making lot sizes smaller, the cost savings to the developer is obviously that there's less land cost per unit. So assuming the land kind of stays the same price across the board, we're looking at the same parcel size across the board. But in the first example, you've got to spread that cost just across one unit. In the second example, you get to spread that land cost across 4 units. And so that's functionally how density bonus works. It just makes it's more efficient cost of land because you get to spread it across more units. If you also allow, in addition to bumping up the density, maybe you also allow attached units as opposed to detached units. Also a function of zoning code. So not just saying, okay, you can have more dwelling units per acre, you're also saying, and you can have those units attached together. That gets you even more cost savings because you have the same cost savings on land. So you're getting kind of that density bonus on the land cost, but you also save on the construction cost because it's a more efficient unit type to build from a construction cost standpoint. So that's functionally how it works. When we think about these policy levers that I was talking through, on the subsidy side, that's pretty easy to visualize, right? Like that just means if your costs are here and your rents are here and you've got to kind of balance those out as a developer to make sure the deal can pencil or work, then if the local government can help lower your costs, that helps manage that balance so that you're not building here and trying to rent here. In a land use and zoning, it's a little bit more challenging to visualize. And so this just helps us understand kind of the efficiency that we're gaining through this process. it doesn't always have to look like different unit types. It doesn't always have to look like more units. Another way that we see this in local policy is just legalizing accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. That is also a way to increase the number of units per lot, but in doing that in a way that's really context sensitive to the neighborhood. So a lot of times that will have a requirement on how big the lot is. It will also generally say the two dwelling units can't be the same size. One has to be kind of the main house and one's an accessory. And so that's another way of thinking about how can we increase the efficiency on our land use, which also has really positive impacts typically on the environmental footprint as well, if we're kind of increasing our efficiency there. I do want to just acknowledge that there was an analysis, I think it was last year or the year before, that was done for Gary Communities Investment that looked at what if we did increase density in Jefferson County along just looking at vacant parcels. And so the metric here was saying, well, what if we just said 10% of land area? We're not talking about upzoning everywhere, 10% of vacant land. If we increase the zoning on that 10% to 10 dwelling units per acre, what could that create from a housing perspective? And as David mentioned, we're in a real housing shortage metro-wide right now. And so we're looking at ways, how can we bolster that supply? Obviously has an economic impact on housing prices as well. When supply is constrained, housing prices go up faster. When housing supply is unlocked, then housing prices mitigate a little bit as well. So when we look at this, if 10% of vacant land in Jeffco was zoned for 10 dwelling units per acre or more, that would create the potential for another 100,000 units in Jefferson County. And so that's not to say we're about to build 100,000 units, but it does at least acknowledge that these even moderate increases in density, 10% of land area and just 10 dwelling units per acre, you can see some visuals of what that might look like, that actually can have a really, really big impact on our housing needs within the county. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was a great overview. I know it's so hard to boil very complex topics down to these consumable takeaways for the audience, and both you and David did an amazing job. I do have one quick question for you, Molly, before we move into the Q&A with our audience. What are some of the things that local leaders have had to balance when they're different, or when they're considering some of these different policies? I mean, there's always trade-offs and conflicting, sometimes what feels like conflicting interests. So tell us a little bit more in your experience about what are those things that they have to balance?
Sure. So that, and I would say that is the biggest challenge. Everybody kind of acknowledges, look, housing prices are not what we'd like them to be, and what do we do about it, and where do we prioritize? And local jurisdictions, I would say, first and foremost, have to prioritize how do we want to manage all of the kind of priorities community-wide. But we are seeing increasingly that communities are saying housing prices are a problem, and we want local government to start to prioritize this, both through funding, but also through some of these other priorities. And so number one is just saying we're going to prioritize housing and think about real policy solutions to help address those needs. The next thing that communities really have to think about is where along that housing spectrum do we want to prioritize either funding resources or land use and zoning resources? And that's one of the reasons I have that kind of continuum up, is to acknowledge that there are different solutions at different points in the housing continuum. And so understanding the community's actual needs and where those fall will help inform policymakers to say, oh, we really need to focus on rental units or entry-level home ownership or permanent supportive housing. And so doing some needs assessment work will help communities frame where their core needs are. And then it's really about kind of balancing what solutions work at different points in the spectrum, and how to balance that with existing residents and what their community culture is within that, and what's appropriate in that context. I think, and most housing policy advocates and local government workers, I think, are really trying to say, we want solutions that fit our community and that are well tailored, and those are out there. And I think a lot of times there's backlash against, like, oh no, what if they do this or that or the other? But there really are incremental solutions across the board, and so it's just about finding what fits and what works in different communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. And just a reminder to our audience that you can use the Q&A feature in our Zoom platform to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many of these as we have time for. I'm going to start with a question that we have gotten through our Q&A, and this is concerning Prop 123. I think we've talked about this in this webinar series, and I also think a lot of folks are familiar with this, this ballot issue that was passed a couple of years ago. And so when we talk about 90 days for Prop 123 streamline process. So I believe that is something that is recommended within that implementation plan. Oh, and the question just disappeared. So I'm not sure. So the question, I believe that, thank you. Thanks, Graham. So with that Prop 123 90-day process, is that an achievable process at the local level? And, what are the key components that we've talked about that could facilitate that?
I'll take a stab, and David, feel free to jump in as well. So that is a requirement for communities to opt into 123, that they have to do a 90-day sort of approval timeline if a project includes affordable, capital A affordable units. The answer to the question is currently unknown. I think the state is currently trying to provide additional direction. It's not super clear exactly when that clock starts and what the obligations are for both cities and developers in making sure kind of the materials are all lined up for that approval. It does not include a rezone, so 90 days does not have to apply to a rezone, but it's still a little murky on exactly how that's going to be measured. David, do you have any other insight on that?
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic if they could process some site approvals in 90 days. A little bit skeptical based on what I've seen that it can be done, but it's a great target to have. There are a lot of jurisdictions up and down the Front Range that already give priority status to any development that includes at least affordable units, 80% AMI and less. Colorado Springs, Loveland. So you basically get a front of the line pass, if you will, on all of these processes and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that they won't get hung up anywhere, but I would be ecstatic to see a 90-day approval period for attainable and affordable projects.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And actually, a follow-up question. I was just making some notes during your presentation, David, and wanted to just get your opinion on, anyone who might be concerned that a faster review process still allows for that appropriate amount of quality control and public input and due process. Can you weigh in a little bit on that, how we can still expedite some of these processes? As you say, time is money, but still make sure that we're covering all the important pieces that are really critical to the safety and the health and the character of the neighborhood.
Yeah, well, I would say no, we definitely do not want to shortcut the examination of all of those criteria. All those criteria in each jurisdiction's regulation are there for a reason. Each of those need to be inspected on each project. I know that in Jefferson County, part of the delay is the referral agencies. So Jefferson County or Arvada or Golden or whoever could change their process to streamline everything in the 90 days. But it's all of the external agencies, the fire district, the water district, the CDOT, the Parks and Wildlife, oftentimes they are waiting for responses from all of these external agencies to be able to move things forward. So if we can get everybody kind of on that same page, I don't know what you do. You put a red flag at the top of the folder or green flag or whatever it is, so that we can get everybody kind of on board at that streamline things that are either affordable or attainable, those kind of needs that are identified by the housing assessments, as Molly was saying. We can move those things a lot more quickly. But Loveland is the first one that comes to mind, that they actually have a process where your project gets deemed affordable. You apply for it and it gets deemed affordable, and you have priority position on all the reviews moving forward. I don't know that they guarantee any timelines, but you have priority process.
Great. Thank you so much, David. All right, we've got a bunch of questions coming in through our Q&A. And so the first is around just public sentiment. And I think we've touched upon this in other webinars and certainly today as well. But what are some of your thoughts on the best way and the most effective strategies for just changing the public discussion around housing affordability? Just what works and what are some of those myths that really need to be dispelled before we can have a meaningful conversation? And that can go to either of you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go first. I think that there's a lack of understanding of how existing homeowners and existing communities are impacted by an undersupplied market. The median home price in 2023 in Metro Denver area, I believe, was $635,000. Yeah, it's over $600,000. So there might be a market correction that might bring that down to 600, but it's not going below 600 again unless the entire housing industry crashes, which we don't want that to happen because that means that we're going into a recession and everything. So I think that everybody needs to understand that an undersupplied market equates to much higher values, which is higher property taxes, and much higher rents, because now the jump to get from being a renter to being a homeowner is so great that the rental owners more or less have a captive audience. They have a captive clientele, right? So all of those things work together. I like to pick on them. City of Boulder is a great example. The city of Boulder's out on being restrictive on their zoning and their housing policies was that they have all this land around the city of Boulder in which to, for things to move. But the median home price in Boulder is $935,000. So when you look at the effect of restrictive zoning and restrictive policies like anti-growth caps, like growth caps that were put in place in Golden. Golden is a little land restrained, and Lakewood, the result is huge increases in property values, huge increases in taxes, huge increases in rents. And so the answer is, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So if everybody says no to every single new residential development that's proposed, if nothing changes, nothing changes. There is only one direction for the trajectory of the price of everything where you live, and that is up. So somebody somewhere has to say yes. And I think that comes in. And I'm actually hearing a lot more in hearings about communities coming forward and saying, hey, we're not against building housing. We just want to make sure it's done right. We just want to make sure it's not done in a detrimental way to us, which is to your point of we don't want to skimp kind of on the examination process. We want to expedite it, but we don't want to eliminate important things that need to be looked at.
Very well said. That's a nice summary. I appreciate that. Molly, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna, I agree. I think talking about kind of a realistic understanding of trade-offs in that there's no such thing as keeping our community exactly what it is right now, because by making that decision, that has other implications, right? So understanding trade-offs, like David said, I think is really important. I would also add that in addition to kind of changing the conversation, making it more I guess, changing the discourse in a way that helps highlight needs and helps highlight that that's for regular people and that these trade-offs. There's also, we have this kind of mentality in land use right now or over the past 10 to 20 years where we kind of make everything conditional. So instead of saying, all right, this parcel is entitled for exactly this, we tend to set those bars really low and then make each individual development go back out to the public and ask again, what do you want? So if we move more toward entitlements that really help address the housing needs up front, then we reduce the controversial conversations around each and every specific development. And so really looking at doing a lot of work up front on a zoning code to say, this is what's appropriate here, and we're gonna let you build it if you're building that thing. That's essentially what entitlement is, right? It's saying like, yes, we already said you can do a duplex here, so we're not gonna make you go ask your neighbors again if you can do a duplex here, right? And so really being upfront with setting the zoning code right the first time instead of kind of setting a really low threshold and then making every development ask the same question over and over. That's when it gets really hard and really controversial, and that's where political will starts to play a role. And we've sort of allowed the vocal public voice to impact other people's property values, to say, well, I don't like what you're doing right there, so I, as a neighbor, get to decide that. When really that there is kind of a property rights conversation to be had there with entitlement zoning. And so it's not just about changing the conversation, it's also changing and thinking through really before the project starts, what should go here and if that's appropriate, and making sure we're kind of paving the way for that so that development can be efficient.
Great, great. Thank you so much. So this next question, I think might be a good one for David to start with, and it concerns mixed income development. And so the question is, do mixed income developments address the cost factor of development? For example, if 20% of the development is allocated for affordable and the rest is market, I think the idea is, would that be able to cover some of that cost factor because you're mixing in the market rate with the affordable? So David, could you talk to that scenario?
Sure. First of all, I am a big proponent of mixed income communities. I think that just for the clients, for the people who live there, who buy there, especially the people that are trying to make their way up the continuum, and improve their situation, mixed income communities have the best outcomes for that. Yeah, I believe the 20% affordable is like the Denver inclusionary housing standard. The truth is the cost is the cost. So if it costs $300,000 a unit to build, a multifamily building, but 20% of them are going to be affordable, which means you can't charge a market rate or a rate that's going to recoup the cost on that unit. That cost literally has to be shifted to the other units. And then you are subsidizing some units for this is very generalization and every project is different, but you are using the market rate units to subsidize the affordable units if that subsidy is not coming from, CHFA or Prop 123 or Colorado Concern or someplace like that. And either it works or it doesn't. And the truth is, if that's a requirement and it doesn't work, the project doesn't get built. That's what happens. But I am a big proponent of mixed income communities. Maybe not, I'm not a big proponent of inclusionary zoning being forced. I'm more of a proponent of incentives. But I think for the clients, mixed income communities are a great outcome.
Great, great. Molly, anything you want to add?
No, I think that was David covered it well. I think that's a good perspective on kind of the mixed income approach. And I think a lot of times we think about mixed income buildings versus mixed income communities. Mixed income buildings can be harder to finance. Mixed income communities are a lot about what are we allowing to be built within a neighborhood, and are we allowing a diversity of product types that might allow for a diversity of incomes as well. So I just kind of broaden that to, think about mixed incomes, not just as a building itself, but also as kind of what we allow in a community overall.
I'll add one more thing in there. I think that community land trusts are a fantastic tool along those lines. You could build whatever, a community of 100 houses, townhouses, small single families, whatever they are, and take 20 of those and put those in a community land trust. And now you have a mixed income community because you have the market rate people buying these houses here. You have kind of subsidized housing controlled by the community land trust over here, but everybody is living in the same community. There's no literal lines drawn on the ground or anything. They're all part of a community.
That's great. That's great. So let's talk a little, this is actually a really intriguing question. Let's talk a little bit about property taxes. And for homeowners that are sensitive to the increases in property taxes, what kind of impact or change on the future of just single family homes and policies? How does property taxes factor into this when you're considering affordability, particularly with single family homes, multifamily homes, and especially those people who are looking to get into home ownership?
I'll jump in first, and then David, feel free to jump in as well. I would say it's kind of a couple of things to think about when we talk about property taxes, especially in Colorado. One is they have been going up primarily because valuations are up, right? And so it feels like we're getting hit and hit and hit. In the broader national context, Colorado has some of the lowest property taxes in the country. So the Intermountain West is very low property tax state, whereas compared to somewhere like Texas, which has really, really high property taxes because they finance, that's basically how they finance local government. So I think it's important to kind of talk about context, that I don't want to be insensitive to property taxes rising, because that has a real serious impact on some people's household finances. But it's also important to acknowledge the broader context that we're a pretty low property tax state overall. And so we're kind of fighting both of these elements of kind of how much our property taxes are contributing to overall public finance, but also understanding that it's a real challenge for some people to try and keep up with that, who have no control over the fact that their house is getting, valued a lot higher, and that's a real issue. So on the policy side, How we typically think about dealing with that is looking at property tax exemptions or waivers. The homestead property taxes is sort of helps keep property taxes low for folks that have a fixed income or are over a certain age. There's a lot of ways to kind of manage to that. But targeting that intervention to households that really do need it and really are burdened by it, as opposed to households that are just like, oh, that doesn't feel good, right? And there is a difference there than folks that really their household expenses cannot sustain that level of rising. And so there are policy interventions that help address that from a qualification and income qualification standpoint. So we can really target those interventions to folks that need it.
That's a great answer. David, anything to add?
Yeah, property taxes are made up of two things, and that is the mill levy that you're paying, which is controlled by our legislature and our Constitution, and property values. So property values are, you want to think of kind of like the Fed's target inflation rate. Like you want your property to appreciate, but if it appreciates a nice 2 to 5% every year, that's wonderful. Between 2020 and 2023, everybody's property appreciated 40%. So and everybody's feeling the pinch on property taxes, and that is the reason. The reason is not because they raised the mill levy or we're actually a very low tax state. It's because the value of everybody's property went up so fast, so quickly over the last couple of years. That is a product of supply and demand. So that is the product of an undersupplied market where the demand completely outstrips the supply, and therefore everything becomes more valuable. Again, there will be market corrections, but unless we go into a wholesale recession like 2008, which, knocking on wood, hopefully not. I think we're getting close to having avoided that. Those values are not going to drop significantly since that point. Hopefully the whole idea is wages will catch up. Everybody's personal income will catch up. That takes time. When things go up that sharply, and that's applies for everything, groceries, property values, everything, they will catch up, but it takes time. So it's much better if we keep a natural balance between the supply and the demand. You get that just nice kind of steady appreciation climb, and it doesn't feel like, all of a sudden you're getting this huge bill that, oh my God, how am I going to pay this?
And just to follow up too, I think, we've talked a lot about kind of product diversity and price point diversity within the housing market, and that plays a role as well. I mean, if we create more opportunity to have a broader range of housing price points and housing products, so, a duplex, for example, or a townhome are typically going to be lower priced than a single family home of the same age, and they appreciate differently. And so having different options so that people don't have to feel like, oh, I have to buy this giant single family house that's really high value and therefore high property tax, or they can downsize to manage their household expenses. The more product and price point diversity we have, the more we allow people to really calibrate their individual situation to what works best for them, both from an expense standpoint, a tax standpoint as well. And so a lot of this does come back to both supply in general, like David was saying, but also what we allow that supply to be.
Great. We have time for one more question, and I saved a really intriguing one for the very last question, and that's regarding modular or prefab homes. And there was a question from the audience of, is there a possibility for that to start gaining a foothold in Colorado as a solution to affordable housing? Certainly you all know more about this than I do, but typically zoning practices are generally very restrictive on prefab, but those policies are also very dated back to a time when prefab options were very different than what are available today. So would love to hear your thoughts on that, and if that is a potential solution for affordable housing.
Yeah, I'd love to answer that. I'm a big fan of what's termed modular housing, which, here's another understanding thing, is very different than mobile housing. So both are manufactured in a facility, but mobile homes are much different than, as you said, Sarah. Modular housing or prefabricated housing has come light years in the past 20 or 30 years. And there are several people who are actually building plants now in Colorado. I know Fading West was mentioned. They're in Buena Vista. Great guys. I know them. I'm trying to work with them. I think it's very much going to make an impact in that affordable space and that attainable housing space, because and when you build it in a factory, you can control they've got waste down to 6 or 7% instead of 30% in the field. It's better for the environment. Quite honestly, it's a better product because you're not building it in the weather, you're not building it in the environment, you're building it in a very controlled condition. They're already doing it in the mountain towns where labor is short, supplies are short. They can save literally 30 or 40% construction costs by doing modular in the mountain towns. In the Metro Denver area, it's about the same. It's about a wash, but you're probably getting a better product. I personally am looking at doing projects with modular. I think it's a great solution, and I hope to see more of it. And I also think that jurisdictions are taking that into account and kind of changing their regulations there in a code to recognize the difference, that actually both of them, both mobile and manufactured housing, do make a difference. They do make a product that kind of fits in that lower 80% AMI and lower, maybe 100% AMI and lower. But jurisdictions are starting to recognize that there's a difference between those two. Molly?
Great.
Yeah, I would just add kind of on the policy side, there's a couple of things happening that are trying to, I think, catalyze this type of development. One is on the economic development side. So the state has had some economic development incentives about creating modular factories. So kind of the business side of saying we need these close, which is really important on the housing cost side as well, because one of the biggest costs of modular is the transportation of the components and of the units. And so the closer the factory is to where the unit is being delivered, the more efficient that process is and the more cost effective it is as well on the end product. So that's kind of the economic development side of how the state is trying to catalyze and incentivize some of these types of builders. And then on the kind of local policy side, Sarah, you mentioned some zoning. David, you mentioned, I think you mentioned inspections as well. And so a lot of kind of the local side has to do with education around understanding when different standards apply and how that works. And a lot of times it's exactly the same standard, but there may be a different approval mechanism. So a lot of it is informing and educating inspectors to make sure that process is smooth and that it's efficient as well. I would say we are seeing more modular developers, kind of both manufacturers and developers that are using modular pop up. There's some really interesting opportunities for modular at scale to actually build multifamily with modular as well. And so I think we're seeing more communities look at that. We're even seeing some kind of historic large scale builders, like Oakwood Homes and some of those start to move into modular as well as part of their product delivery to deliver lower price points. And so I certainly think it will be here. Individual companies, it's hard to say who's kind of, there's a lot of people kind of trying it right now. And I think some of that will continue to shake out as it becomes more and more common. It's certainly a really effective way to deliver more kind of entry-level price points, even through market rate.
Great. Well, thank you both. That was a very intriguing question to end our discussion on, and wanted to make sure we covered that. So again, thank you, David and Molly, for spending some time with us today, sharing your expertise about about how housing is built and how the different things that can be done to create more affordability. So for those of you who are listening, if you'd like to learn a little bit more or get involved, there are a few ways that you can do that. One of our resources is the brand new Jeffco Advocacy Network website, which has links to a whole host of resources, including research and places to connect in Jeffco with folks who are active in this work. The Bell Policy Center has also created a dedicated page for Jeffco housing content and research, which will also include recordings of each of these webinars. And our partners at the Colorado Gives Foundation also have a page about their housing work, and you can also sign up for future webinars there as well. And I believe Graham has done a wonderful job putting those links into the chat for you. So the fun continues next month. We have another webinar scheduled in this series. And so that is scheduled for April 17th. And that's where we'll be talking about historical barriers to housing, or historical housing barriers in Jefferson County. And you can register at the Colorado Gives Foundation link that is included in the chat, but also on the website. So with that, that concludes our session for today. Again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. We hope you learned a lot more about housing. I know I did. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in April.
Thank you,
you.
everyone.